I won't let anything happen to you or our child," he whispered, but the words reached me before I could even think of running. Rain splashed against the sidewalk like silver needles, and the city lights reflected off puddles in fractured patterns that made the world seem both enormous and confining. I clutched my coat tighter around me, feeling the damp chill creep into my bones as my breath fogged in quick, uneven puffs. My apartment felt impossibly far away, yet I couldn't turn back. Not yet. Jason Crawford's presence lingered even from a distance, a shadow of authority and concern that I couldn't shake. Every street corner, every passing cab, seemed to echo with his unspoken vigilance. I reached into my bag and felt the crumpled envelope he had left the night before, the one with the ultrasound photo I hadn't wanted him to see, the tiny image of the life I was carrying that made my stomach knot with both fear and awe. My fingers trembled as I traced the faint outline, remembering the quiet mornings when I sat on my bed, hand pressed over my heart, imagining what it would be like to welcome someone so fragile and completely dependent on me into the world. I took a deep breath, letting the chilly air fill my lungs, trying to steady my racing thoughts, and then I started walking, careful to avoid puddles and the slick pavement, each step a measured beat in a rhythm I had to maintain to stay grounded. Thoughts of Jason followed me, persistent and unrelenting, but not threatening, not yet. They carried a strange warmth beneath the tension, a recognition that even in his shadowy, commanding presence, he had chosen to act without coercion, protecting rather than imposing. I passed the corner store and glimpsed my reflection in the rain-streaked glass, the face of a woman caught between independence and inevitable connection, and I realized that somewhere inside me a part of my resistance was bending, curious about the care wrapped in his authority. The city hummed around me, the low roar of traffic, the distant siren, the faint clatter of construction tools echoing in alleyways, all composing a symphony of chaos that contrasted with the fragile pulse of hope I carried within. Each step brought me closer to home, yet also closer to confronting the undeniable truth that someone had seen me, all of me, the layers of fear, pride, and responsibility, and had chosen to respond with patience and protection. I reached my apartment building, the lobby dimly lit, the familiar scent of old carpet and hallway cleaners mingling in the damp air. I fumbled with my keys, hands slick, heart still hammering, and as I pushed the door open, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, the electric edge of knowing that the ordinary rhythm of my life had shifted, and that every choice from this moment on carried weight far beyond my understanding. Upstairs, the drawer I had locked for privacy beckoned, a small fortress of secrets and intimacies, and I knew that tonight, every glance, every whispered step, and every calculated pause would define the fragile boundary between fear and trust, between leaving and surrendering, between the life I thought I had and the one quietly waiting in the shadow of Jason Crawford's concern. The next morning arrived with the city still wrapped in mist, the streets glistening with remnants of the previous night's rain, and the distant hum of traffic, a low, constant rhythm that reminded me of how alive the world continued even when I felt suspended in uncertainty. I had barely slept, my mind racing through the image of the tiny ultrasound photo, the delicate black and white outline of a life that I had carried quietly, unseen, until Jason discovered it. The apartment was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as I moved through the narrow hallway toward the kitchen, my fingers brushing over the cool wooden surfaces, each sound magnified in the stillness, a reminder that every decision I made now carried the weight of responsibility not only for myself, but for the small being growing inside me. I poured a cup of coffee and watched the steam curl upward, taking slow, measured sips, grounding myself in the familiar warmth and bitterness as my thoughts shifted to the message Jason had left the night before, the careful words that carried concern and a promise of protection without expectation, and I realized the depth of his understanding, how he had seen me, the real me, and chosen to respond with patience and foresight rather than anger. The phone buzzed lightly on the counter, a text that made my heart skip, a simple note confirming that someone would be at the building later to ensure my safety, leaving it unsigned but unmistakably from him, the attention quiet but absolute. I dressed carefully, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because each movement was a form of preparation, a ritual of reclaiming calm and control in a world that had suddenly become precarious. As I stepped out onto the street, the crisp morning air carried the scent of wet asphalt and faint traces of bakery goods from a nearby corner store, mundane details that anchored me even as the weight of possibility pressed heavily on my chest. Jason waited at a distance, leaning against a sleek black SUV that gleamed despite the drizzle, his posture relaxed yet commanding, eyes scanning the street with careful calculation, aware of everything without intruding. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, an acknowledgement that his presence, even unobtrusive, shifted the balance of fear into cautious hope. We moved through the streets together, unspoken understanding between us, the rhythm of our steps in sync with the city around us, and I realized that the fragile boundary between independence and reliance was beginning to blur, that the care and attention he offered was not something I needed to defend against, but something I could, cautiously, accept. Each step brought us closer to the office where I planned to continue preparations for the arrival of the new life. The small space filled with sunlight through large windows, casting patterns that danced across the floor, illuminating the quiet determination etched into my movements. Jason observed without comment, his presence a constant reminder that protection could coexist with respect, that the promise made in whispers and subtle gestures could carry more weight than overt declarations. I placed the ultrasound photo carefully on the desk, its image small yet profoundly significant, and felt the shift in my own awareness, understanding that the day ahead would require choices, attention, and trust, and that for the first time since discovery, the thought of facing the future with someone equally committed to safeguarding both me and the child did not fill me with anxiety but a tentative, cautious hope that perhaps, even in a world ruled by power and unseen rules, there was space for care, for protection, and for a new beginning. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, casting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor, illuminating the small details of the room, the scattered papers, the neatly arranged office supplies, and the ultrasound photo that rested on the desk, a silent reminder of the fragile life it represented. Emily moved with deliberate care, adjusting the small chairs and clearing a space for the preparations that needed to be made, every gesture a careful balance between precision and fatigue. Yet there was a lightness to her movements, a quiet hope that had begun to root itself in the corners of her mind. The city outside was a hum of motion, cars flowing past like rivers of sound, pedestrians crossing intersections with purposeful steps, but inside, time slowed, each breath measured, each heartbeat a drum keeping rhythm with the unseen promise that Jason had quietly made through his actions rather than words. He appeared at the entrance of the office without knocking, a figure of calm authority, his dark tailored suit reflecting the sunlight in subtle glimmers, and Emily froze for a moment, her chest tightening, realizing that even his quiet presence carried a weight that could not be ignored yet was strangely comforting. He did not speak immediately, merely observed her organizing the small items for the day, the way she interacted with the space, the care she took with objects that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. And in that quiet observation, there was an acknowledgement, a recognition of her dedication, of her commitment to the life she was nurturing. The silence was filled with unspoken understanding, the room holding a tense yet gentle energy that shifted slightly as Jason finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a resonance that made Emily feel both seen and understood. He asked about the plans for the day, about the preparations, his questions practical, but his tone laced with an unspoken concern, a desire to ensure that nothing untoward would affect the careful balance she had created. Emily responded carefully, detailing the tasks, the small precautions she had taken, the schedule she had set to maintain order and safety, and Jason listened, nodding at intervals, his expression softening as he considered her words, the subtle pride and protectiveness weaving through his attention without ever crossing into overbearing. Outside, the city carried on, the sun climbing higher, the distant horns and footsteps a constant reminder of the world beyond the walls. Yet inside, there was a cocoon of trust beginning to form, fragile but resilient, as Emily felt the tension ease slightly, the sharp edges of fear and uncertainty smoothing under the quiet steadiness of his presence. They moved together through the office, arranging files, checking supplies, and Jason offered suggestions with precision and care, not demanding, not insisting, merely guiding. And Emily realized that in this careful cooperation there was a new rhythm, one that allowed for both independence and support, the boundaries respected yet gently expanded. The afternoon waned and shadows stretched across the room, painting the floor in patterns of light and dark, and Emily felt a quiet strength in knowing that she was not alone, that there was a partnership forming, silent yet profound, that would carry both her and the life she protected through the challenges to come. As she placed the final item in its place, she looked up at Jason and saw a reflection of commitment and steadiness, an assurance that even in a world of unpredictability and hidden pressures, there was space for care, for preparation, and for the gentle weaving of trust that would guide them forward, one careful step at a time. The late afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long, soft shadows that moved across the floor as if tracing the rhythm of time itself, and Emily felt the subtle weight of anticipation settling over her, the quiet hum of the city. Outside a constant backdrop to the careful preparations she continued within the office. Every surface, every item arranged with meticulous care, seemed to carry an unspoken promise that today would not merely be another day of routines, but a step forward in a life being quietly reshaped by unseen forces and deliberate attention. Jason Crawford stood near the entrance, hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed yet alert, observing without interrupting, his presence a silent reassurance, a steadying force that contrasted with the swirl of thoughts and responsibilities in Emily's mind. The small ultrasound photo rested on the desk, its significance amplified by the shared understanding between them, a symbol of trust and mutual recognition that required no words to communicate the depth of care and commitment involved. Emily moved carefully, checking schedules, reviewing documents, making sure that every detail was accounted for, while Jason's gaze followed her movements, not intrusively, but with a calm attentiveness that made each motion feel acknowledged and supported. The air was filled with the faint scent of coffee, mingling with the slightly damp smell carried in from the street, a reminder of the outside world continuing its relentless pace. Yet inside the office, time seemed suspended, every action deliberate, every gesture measured, every glance loaded with silent understanding. As Emily organized a small corner of the workspace, adjusting papers and supplies, she felt a sense of ease, a fragile but growing confidence that she was not alone, that the presence of someone equally committed to safeguarding the delicate balance of her life, and the life she carried was tangible, present, and quietly reassuring. Jason spoke softly then, in measured tones that did not demand but guided, offering suggestions and observations with precision and care, his attention focused entirely on ensuring that everything was in order, that the plan she had set in motion could proceed without unexpected complications. And Emily found herself responding not out of obligation, but from a shared desire to maintain control, to protect what mattered most. The office felt like a small haven, its walls absorbing the quiet energy of cooperation, of mutual respect and care, and the sun's rays slanted lower, painting the room with patterns that seemed to echo the gentle rhythm of their interactions, the careful choreography of trust forming between them. Emily paused for a moment, placing her hand over the ultrasound photo, and in that brief contact felt the convergence of her responsibilities, her hopes, and the quiet reassurance of Jason's steadfast presence, a reminder that while the world beyond continued in its hurried, often chaotic pace, within this small space, a new understanding, a new rhythm, and a cautiously nurtured hope were taking root, ready to guide them forward, step by careful step, toward the future they were now quietly shaping together. Snow continued to fall softly outside the diner windows while the warmth of the room wrapped around us, a fragile cocoon shielding us from the world beyond. I watched Claire carefully, noticing the small tremors in her hands as she held the ultrasound photo, the tiny image that represented the life we were about to share, a life she had protected fiercely in silence. I reached across the table slowly, deliberately, letting her pull away if she needed space, but she did not. Her fingers brushed mine, Warmth meeting warmth, and the familiar sensation of home that I had taken for granted filled the space between us. I whispered apologies, not the rehearsed kind or the calculated words that had carried weight in boardrooms and family gatherings, but raw, honest words, the kind that exposed every failing and every moment I had let her stand alone. Claire listened quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks, her breathing uneven as the weight of the past days pressed upon her. I could feel the tension in her body, the exhaustion, the fear that I had failed her, and I lowered my forehead gently against her hand resting protectively on her stomach, closing my eyes to let the reality of her presence and the life inside her ground me. For the first time, the city beyond the diner, the skyscrapers, the steel and rain, all felt distant, unimportant, and I understood the true measure of responsibility, of care, of love. Claire guided my hand toward her stomach slowly, hesitantly, and the moment my palm rested there, warmth and life flowed through me, a surge of emotion that made it impossible to think of anything but protecting this small, growing life. I held my gaze on her, steady, silent, letting her see that my presence, my commitment, and my willingness to acknowledge failure and rebuild trust were unwavering. She looked at me with eyes that reflected both vulnerability and hope, and I knew that every misstep, every moment of silence, had brought us to a point where honesty and patience could bridge the gap that fear and pride had created. The quiet hum of the diner, the subtle clink of dishes, and the soft conversations of the staff faded into the background as I focused entirely on Claire, on our child, on the fragile thread of connection we were mending. I whispered promises, simple and true, that I would stand beside her, that I would protect her and our child, that I would listen, and that I would not allow the world to diminish the strength or the peace we needed. Slowly, she leaned back against me, no longer resisting, and I felt a measure of relief that I had not realized I needed. The realization that even in a world defined by control, power, and strategy, the essence of life and love depended on presence, care, and the willingness to stay through uncertainty. Outside, the snow settled quietly over Haven Lake, and inside, the gentle warmth between us spoke louder than any declaration, louder than any gesture of influence, carrying with it the promise of rebuilding, of trust, and of a shared life, one small heartbeat at a time. The evening settled over Haven Lake with a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred, the snow outside falling in slow, deliberate flakes that blanketed the streets and rooftops, muting the sounds of the small town and creating a soft, comforting silence. Inside the cozy inn where we had retreated, Claire and I sat across from one another at a corner table near the window, the remnants of a warm meal before us, steam still rising from empty bowls, carrying the faint aroma of cinnamon and fresh bread. She held her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, fingers tracing the delicate pattern on the ceramic, and I watched her, taking in every small detail, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face, every quiet movement that spoke volumes about the exhaustion and the vulnerability she had carried alone. The scarf I had brought still rested on her shoulders, a small comfort against the cold that lingered both outside and in her body after days of stress and isolation. I spoke softly, not demanding answers, not pressing her, simply acknowledging the weight of everything that had passed and the significance of the moment we were sharing now. Claire lifted her eyes to meet mine, her blue eyes glistening with unshed tears, reflecting both caution and trust, and I felt the fragile tension in the room ease slightly as she allowed herself to exhale, to lean back in her chair, and to let the warmth of our shared presence settle over her. We talked quietly, words chosen with care, the conversation weaving between plans for the days ahead, the preparations for our child, and the simple human need for understanding and support. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the streets in a quiet white that seemed to hold the world at bay, and inside, the light from the small overhead fixtures cast a gentle glow over our faces, highlighting the relief and the tentative peace that was beginning to form. I reached across the table again, lightly, allowing her hand to find mine, a gesture that was both tentative and firm, a reminder that she was not alone and that the choices of the past would not define the support and protection I intended to offer from now on. Claire responded slowly, her fingers curling around mine, and I could feel the pulse of her life, the heartbeat of the child she carried, a tangible connection that deepened the weight of responsibility and the depth of commitment I felt in that moment. We shared quiet laughter, small smiles, and gentle reassurances, each one a step toward rebuilding trust, toward nurturing the sense of safety and belonging that had been fractured by misunderstanding and distance. Time passed almost unnoticed, measured only by the gentle shifting of light across the room and the soft ticking of a nearby clock, and in that span, the world outside, with all its complexity and demands, seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of us, the small life growing within her, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges awaited, we would face them together, with care, patience, and an understanding that true strength lay not in control or power, but in presence, compassion, and unwavering attention to the fragile and the precious. The soft glow of the early morning sun filtered through the frost-coated windows of the small inn, painting the room in pale gold and casting delicate shadows across the wooden floor as Claire stirred slowly beneath her cream-colored blanket. I sat nearby in a chair, careful not to move too abruptly, allowing her to wake fully at her own pace, the quiet hum of the heating system mingling with the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath my shoes. She opened her eyes gradually, meeting my gaze with a faint, hesitant smile, and I felt the familiar ache of relief and gratitude rise within me, knowing she was safe and that the fragile trust we were rebuilding could begin to solidify in these quiet, unspoken moments. Outside, the snow continued to fall in light, almost playful flakes, blanketing the streets and sidewalks in white and muting the distant hum of traffic, leaving the inn surrounded by a serene stillness that seemed to slow time itself. I poured 2 cups of tea and placed one gently before her, watching as she wrapped her fingers around it, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and I noticed the small details, the way her hair fell across her face, the faint shadow beneath her eyes from the past few restless nights, and the subtle way she rested one hand over her stomach as if guarding a delicate secret. The conversation between us began softly, each word deliberate, careful, and measured, not rushed, allowing space for both honesty and reflection, and as she spoke about the small routines she had maintained to care for herself and our child, I listened intently, absorbing every syllable, every pause, every nuance that conveyed the depth of her experience over the past days. I reached across the table once more, lightly touching her hand with mine, and she did not pull away, allowing the physical connection, the unspoken affirmation of presence, to bridge the distance that had formed during her time apart, a bridge built not from force or insistence, but from patience, care, and attentive observation. The aroma of the tea mixed with the faint scent of pine and wood smoke drifting through the slightly ajar window, creating a sense of comfort and grounding that contrasted sharply with the chaos and noise of Manhattan left behind. And in that quiet, shared space, I felt the true measure of connection, the responsibility and privilege of being present, of acknowledging past failings while committing fully to the protection, guidance, and emotional support necessary for both Claire and our child. Moments passed, punctuated by gentle sips of tea and the occasional soft laugh or sigh, each one layering trust and understanding, forming a rhythm that was at once delicate and resilient, a foundation upon which we could cautiously rebuild the life disrupted by absence, fear, and miscommunication. The snow continued its quiet descent, covering the landscape in pristine white, and as Claire lifted her gaze to meet mine again, I understood the simplicity and profundity of what was required: presence, attention, and unwavering care, a recognition that the strength of our bond would not be measured by grand gestures or power, but by the consistent, deliberate, and gentle acts of support that would carry us forward, one careful, mindful step at a time, together as we navigated the uncertainties and quiet joys of the days to come. The soft morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting long, gentle beams across the inn as Claire and I stepped outside, the crunch of fresh snow underfoot punctuating each careful step. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant warmth of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys, creating a serene cocoon around the small town of Haven Lake. I kept a steady pace beside her, careful not to rush or crowd, allowing her the space to breathe and to feel the quiet support of my presence. She walked with her coat wrapped tightly, one hand resting instinctively over her stomach, the other brushing lightly against the scarf I had placed there the night before, a symbol of protection and reassurance. We moved toward the small lakeside path, the water frozen at the edges, reflecting the pale blue sky and the delicate snowfall that continued in silent rhythm, a mirror to the calm that had begun to settle between us. Conversation was sparse at first, punctuated by small observations about the snow, the distant calls of birds, and the subtle creaking of tree branches under the weight of frost, each word a gentle bridge across the space that had been widened by fear, pride, and distance. I noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, evidence of restless nights and days carried with quiet endurance, and I could feel the urgency and tenderness in my chest, the responsibility to provide care, presence, and comfort in ways I had failed to do before. Claire glanced at me briefly, her eyes catching mine with a mixture of caution and tentative trust, and I gave the smallest nod, a silent affirmation that I was here, that I had come fully prepared to stay, to witness, to protect, and to nurture both her and the life she carried. We paused at a small wooden bench near the lake, the surface dusted lightly with snow, and she allowed herself to sit, folding her hands over her stomach as if to shield and cherish at once, and I lowered myself beside her, close enough to offer warmth without imposing. The quiet was profound, broken only by the subtle rustle of her coat and the soft whistle of the wind across the frozen water, and in that silence, a mutual understanding took shape, delicate but undeniable. That presence and attentiveness were more powerful than any words, more sustaining than any grand gesture, and more meaningful than any material provision. I extended my hand toward hers again, and she accepted it, fingers intertwining naturally, conveying the fragile trust and reassurance that had been carefully cultivated over these past days. We remained there for long minutes, breathing in the crisp air, listening to the faint echoes of life around the lake, each heartbeat, each exhale a reminder of the shared connection and commitment we were building together. Claire tilted her head slightly to watch the small ripples across the ice and then lifted her eyes to mine, and in that gaze, I saw the quiet strength, the fragile hope, and the patient resilience that had carried her through uncertainty, and I understood fully that love, protection, and presence were measured not by grandeur or power, but by the steady willingness to remain, to witness, and to nurture, one careful, mindful moment at a time. As we prepared together for the life unfolding before us, the future now held in shared hands, hearts, and hopes.